Hi, this is Margaret Meloni, and welcome to the Death Dhamma podcast. Together we will consider life, death, and impermanence. Because in between birth and death, we lose things. Not just our glasses and our keys. We lose identities, relationships, ideas, and more. But what we can gain right now is facing this together, and we will gain freedom, peace, and progress on our path. Hello, my friends, and welcome to the podcast. Today's guest is, with a drum roll please, today's guest is me. I'm going to interview myself, which is a little interesting, weird, right? So today, Margaret Meloni, me, I am your podcast guest, and I would like to explain to you why. You know that this season we are talking about, death with a small d, disappointments, things that have changed or happened in our lives that are evidence of impermanence, and how we faced them and what happened and how we got through the challenge. And it just seemed fair to me that as I'm going around interviewing people who are generously sharing their stories, for example, check out episode 1 where Justin Whitaker shares his story of a difficult relationship, that it seems reasonable that I might share with you as well. If you've been with the podcast through season 1, and if you've been with me through that and through my 2 books, Carpooling with Death and the more recently released Sitting with Death, you know my story of death with a capital D, in a sense, right? You know that I was inspired to do any of this because of going through the death of some of my family members, my father, and then 2 years later, my mother and my husband. And you know about that. I reference it. I talk about it. It shows up when I write. So today, I'm not here to talk about that because remember, this is season 2 and we're talking about different kinds of death. We're talking about the deaths of when you lost a thing or an idea or a relationship. My thing, idea, or relationship that I lost was a job. Once upon a time, before I was a teacher and before I wrote about death and Buddhism and, Death Dhamma, I was in the corporate world and I was in IT. And I loved it. I started my career as a computer programmer and I loved that. Then I really wanted to get into leadership. And at first I was very frustrated because it felt like leadership roles weren't coming my way. But one day, leadership roles began to come, and the first role that surfaced was for me to be a project manager. And spoiler alert, some of you who know, I'll say both sides of my life, the life where I talk about Buddhism and my other life, I now teach project management. So that was my entree into leadership, was to be a project manager in IT. And I started off with small, one project at a time. And then as my skills grew and the company I worked for had higher demand, I began, leading more projects, more complicated projects. It was the way in which I, climbed the ranks. And early in my career, yes, I was very much about goals, and goals were about getting promotions and climbing the ranks and, in a sense, having more power. I want to think that I wasn't a power-hungry leader, but certainly running bigger projects, having bigger teams, like having 100 people reporting to you, that did absolutely represent the growth that I was looking for. So that's what I was doing. And I worked very hard. Some of you, if you know me, you're laughing because some of my friends still accuse me of being a workaholic, which is probably fair and still true. But the time period that I'm sharing with you, it was work. And I would even work sometimes on Sunday mornings just because I had this boss who liked us to be working 24/7. And so I would purposefully save writing of my status report and do it on a Sunday morning at home, with my computer at home, and then send it to him. And then in that way, I had worked on a Sunday, right? So that's the world I was in. I was embracing it. I was going full throttle. I was burned out and exhausted, to be certain. But I would have told you that I was happy. I would have told you I was very happy. Well, one day I was called to my boss's office, and the door closed, and behind the door was our company's human resources attorney. And at that time, I remember thinking, oh my gosh, one of my people is in trouble. And then the human resources attorney started speaking to me about me. And I realized, oh, I'm in trouble. So I was the one who was in trouble. And so this was the beginning of this loss of a thing. And so you can tell the loss of the thing was the loss of the job, the loss of that position, which I had worked so hard to get and that I was so proud of, being at this like director type level in my position, with this large group of people reporting to me. So I was pretty excited about all of that. But in that moment, I began to see, and as I was listening to what was being said, I had this realization, I'm not going to be working here anymore. This is about me leaving. They want me to leave. And I can't tell you that I'm so smart and strategic. What I can say is that in that moment, when we talk about, fight or flight and freeze and all that, that I froze and I just became silent. And I didn't say anything unless I absolutely was required to. And I listened. And as I listened, I realized, this is a thing that happens in the corporate world. Again, they don't want me here anymore. And instead of sitting down and just negotiating and saying, hey, we don't want you here anymore, why don't you leave? I was being accused of some behavior that I did not engage in, of which there was no proof. But I think they thought by just leveling these accusations at me that maybe I would become upset or that I would do something that then would give them a real reason, right, to let me go. But I didn't. I just sat there silently. And of course, when, they said, well, you did this thing, I said, no, I didn't. And we all know that I didn't. And you know that you cannot prove it. And so we went back and forth for a while. And I just waited. And finally, the exasperated attorney, who couldn't get anything out of me, threw up his hands and said, well, we're going to send you home on administrative leave. I said, okay. And I knew that meant, by the way, you're never going to work here anymore. Right? And so I said, okay, how long do you think that's going to take? And he said, oh, it will probably take us a couple of days to complete our investigation. So I said, okay. And I got up and I walked out and I walked back to my office. Oh, and before I left, they said, and you can't do anything. You cannot say anything. You are not to speak to anyone. You are not to do any work. You are not to be on the company systems, et cetera, et cetera. And I remember I was going to have a big meeting the next morning with my department, which was been about 60 people in person, and there were probably about maybe 40 people working offsite. And so I remember I turned and I looked at my boss and I said, I'm having a town hall meeting tomorrow with my group at 8 a.m. And when I don't show up, it's going to cause problems. Would you like me to cancel that meeting before I leave? And my boss looked at me and said, no, I'll take care of it. Well, he did not take care of it. And so the next morning at like 8:05, my cell phone began ringing with all these different people trying to find me. And so I'll just say, he could have stemmed the tide of the rumor mill and the upset, but he chose not to. And I think that was part of the test because, again, they said you can't communicate with anyone. And because the truth is, there was no real thing. There was no real case against me, so to speak. But I think they were looking for me to disobey the orders, right? But I went home and took the orders very seriously. And so as hard as it was, I didn't communicate. And of course, my team began to figure out that there was clearly something going on. I think I did answer one person who just called and said, "Can you at least let us know that you and your loved ones are safe and healthy?" And so I was able to respond to that message and say, "Yes, I am healthy. My loved ones are healthy. We are all safe." And then from there, I think they were able to figure out that, there was something going on, right? And it dragged out a little bit because there was no investigation, because there was nothing to investigate. And then because I didn't, so to speak, disobey orders. But it was very difficult. And so what I need to acknowledge right now is, as I'm telling you, I went home and I, calmly didn't do anything. I cried for 3 days. 3 days, just crying jags off and on all day. That's how attached I was to my job and to that particular, position and what I had built around that position. And at that point, I was probably just learning about Buddhism. I don't know that it would be fair to say I was really Buddhist yet. I was just learning about Buddhism. And so you can look back and you can see I had a lot of selfing going on, right? Like I had this image around myself as this, executive career woman with these responsibilities. And I was attached to that. And, so those are all the things that were happening. The good news was we had a family friend who had a lot of experience in these matters and was able to coach me through this. And so, in my first 3 days of just, crying jags, I was able to stop crying long enough to have a good conversation with this person who very generously, helped me. And he straightened me out. And he said, you're never going to work there again. This is now about finding the best way to separate. And it's true, there's no case, but it's also true that you work in a condition called employment at will, which means technically, a place can fire you just because they want to fire you. But he also said they don't want to do that because that looks bad and could be on the news, right? So he coached me what to do, what to say to, get the best possible situation and negotiation for me to leave this position. And, so it was the death of a lot, right? Because it was the death of, again, this selfing, this ego that I had constructed around the job. It was the death of the actual job. And it was the death of relationships with some people that I really enjoyed working with. And I would say that at that point in my life, that was the most difficult situation probably that I had gone through. Certainly in my adult life, that was at that point in my life, the most difficult thing. So we separate, I move on, I'm out of work for a few months. I was fortunate that it was during a time when there were good jobs available. And it was hard. The first couple of interviews that I went on, I was very shaky. I didn't feel very confident. I was so afraid people would ask me, why are you looking? Or why did you leave your last position? And I didn't know what to say. Almost nobody asked that. And when they did, I just said, they decided to go a different direction, which was true. The different direction being without you, Margaret. That was the direction. And so, ultimately I was able to return to a consulting position. And I will say it was very therapeutic because I wound up working for a company that really valued the people that worked for them and the skills that we brought. And so that was healing. That was very healing. I can say to you that my first day at the new job, I had this interesting emotional thing happen where I all of a sudden became very angry. And I realized, luckily even at that moment, I realized that I was feeling anger because I was still having hard feelings about what had happened. And I was angry that I had to be someplace else starting over again. But there was good in a lot of this. And, sometimes it's hard to look back at difficult things and see the good. But one of the good things that surfaced right away was after I had been out of work for a couple of months, people who hadn't seen me for a while, when they saw me, they said, "Wow, you look great. What are you doing different?" What I was doing differently was I was not working. And I guess that is an indicator of the kind of level of stress and how it was showing, in my physical presentation. My husband, because he was still with us, he was still alive at the time, he never said that he was unhappy with my workaholic ways, but he sure was a lot happier when I was more available to him. And so that taught me a lesson. And that was one of the first times that I worked to become, less of a workaholic and be more available for my family and friends. And ultimately, this change, this impermanence in this job, even though it was, a little death for me, it led me onto a path where I ultimately went into teaching and mentoring and coaching others. And I had more free time with my schedule, and that allowed me to have more time to spend with my elders. So, for example, a few years after all this happened and my mother-in-law, who was in her 90s, began to need to live in assisted living, and I wanted to make sure I could spend time with her a few days a week, I could do that because I created my own schedule. And then as my parents got older, and I wanted to spend more time with them, and then, we did go through my dad's cancer and my mom being on her own without my dad, it gave the freedom to be able to go and spend more time with them, even if I brought my laptop and worked remotely. And so it really did lead to a lot of good things. Of course, it took a while for me to see it. And it took a while for me to be able to talk about it because I carried shame around. Oh my gosh, I lost this great job. How shameful. And now, as hopefully you can tell, I don't feel any shame around it. It is an event that happened in my life. It is one of the deaths I experienced, the loss of this thing, the loss of this perception of self, understanding attachment to, a position and an idea. And so there's a lot of good to that. Now, sometimes at this point in the interview, I ask the person, hey, was this a surprise or did you see it coming? And I'm going to tell you in hindsight, the ever popular hindsight, I realized I should have seen it coming. But on that day, at that moment, it was a surprise. Later, when I reflected back on things my boss had been saying to me and behaviors from him, it became clear that he was trying to push me out and I wasn't getting it. And so in that way, I wasn't prepared for it. And so, I just had to handle it as I handled it, which, as I said, was lots of crying, working with people who had been through similar situations, who could help me through it. I encountered some very kind people. For example, the person who helped me find my next position, he worked for a firm who placed consultants. He was so kind and so understanding to me, and he helped me find this great position. And in fact, even though he's retired now, we still keep in touch a few times a year because he was a kind and good person. And I think at that time in my life, it was really important for me to be interacting with people who were kind and good and not particularly engaged in whatever you want to call it, corporate espionage and backstabbing. And so what really helped with this death, as it were, was to move on, get back to work, engage with kind people, have some time to think about it and process it, and get focused onto what kind of person I wanted to be. For example, when I lost that job, I remember having a discussion with my husband who was basically, well, this is nonsense. Go back into the workforce and go get the same exact kind of job. And I understood his perspective, but I felt like this was an indication that it was time to make a change. And so I wanted to have a similar type of job, but I wanted to use this as an opportunity to change. And so while I went back to work as a consultant, I explored how could I work meaningfully, and yes, of course, help pay the bills, and do it in a way where I can work and position myself in kinder environments. And that's what led me into, I started by doing some coaching and then led me into teaching. So at the time, since I was just barely learning about Buddhism, I can't really say that I had a favorite Buddhist teaching at the time. But what I will say now, I really tend to rely so much on the Four Noble Truths because they're the basis, in my mind, they're the basis for everything. And really that reminder of like, there will be suffering, there can be suffering. This is why. Live that noble eightfold path because that's the way out of suffering. And a good understanding and relationship with impermanence. So I think one of my favorite things is that understanding of impermanence, and even just that short passage, everything that arises ceases. It's almost like a mantra that I live with because I just have found it to be so helpful. And, definitely this loss was a point in my life where my life changed. I used it to change. First, I got kicked. I got a kick in the butt, pardon the expression, and I used that kick in the butt to make a change in my life. And this reminds me of something in season 1 when I was interviewing Timber Hawkeye, and he expressed something to me. He said, everything I've ever let go of had claw marks in it. Yes. Probably the signs were there that it was going to be a good idea for me to let go of that job. But I had to be, kicked away, claw marks in it. And although it was so difficult, and there are some aspects of I don't appreciate, some of it, I do appreciate the life that I've been brought to and what I have now. And so for any of us, what I would say is if you go through painful job separations or other changes, but since I'm talking about my job today, let's say when you go through painful career separations, it's going to hurt. That's normal. And look for people who can provide you positive support. Look for what you can learn. Don't beat yourself up. Don't make this about your whole persona. Examine where you were attached and where you might have had some selfing and ego involved, and see if this brings you to a place where there's a new opportunity to move forward with your career and your life differently. So thank you, everyone, for listening and letting me tell you the story of my time when I lost what I thought was my amazing job, and my experience, aside from the real deaths of actual people dying, of the death of a thing in my life. You've been listening to the Death Dhamma podcast with your host, Margaret Meloni. Thank you so much for being here. Come find me on margaretmeloni.com, margaretmeloni.com. And until we meet again, may you be well, may you be happy, may you be at ease, and may you be free from suffering. Bye for now.